Hi, everybody. Welcome to APL Readers Corner. Thank you for joining us today. I hope everybody's had a good week so far. I'm Tessie, and I'm here with Elizabeth. And today we are going to be talking about steampunk, the genre of steampunk, and the book in particular is The Goblin Emperor by Katherine Addison, who wrote this book as a pseudonym, or that's her pseudonym while she was writing this book, but we'll get into that later. If this is the first time you're joining us for APL Readers Corner, this is a weekly, every Friday at 1 p.m. We are here on Facebook and we review a book from a different genre. So it's kind of a way to get a whole, like a large view of a bunch of different genres and see if maybe you might want to read a book in a new genre. I know it's always kind of difficult to pull yourself away from a genre that you love, but sometimes it's cool to try new things. So that's what we're doing here, and you get to listen to us talk about a cool book.
Yeah, it's so exciting. Oh my goodness. So, for any of you who are unfamiliar with the steampunk genre, you are in for a treat. So, steampunk you might know of and not know you know of it. So, generally, it's historical sci-fi, retrofuturistic, featuring steam-powered machinery. So, what if instead of getting computers and electricity, we'd just gone with more steam? It's normally set in the Victorian era or the Wild West. And it was originally named steampunk in the 80s to contrast with cyberpunk, but that's not where it started. So if you've ever read H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, that's arguably the earliest steampunk because it was actually written in the Victorian era. And then steampunk is very frequently combined with other genres now, like supernatural romance or anime, to sort of give it some additional flavor. There's been some criticism of it for especially the steampunk set in Britain for glorifying imperialism. So there's also some alternate history ones that, in addition to adding the steampunk tech, try to overturn our traditional expectations of what it looks like to govern, what it looks like to rule, which Goblin Emperor does as well. And Goblin Emperor is cool and unique because it is steampunk and high fantasy. So two fantastic things in one. So common themes and characteristics of steampunk, you'll get your steam-powered tech, airships, analog computers instead of digital, steam cannons, automata like the robots, that kind of thing. And an emphasis on technology is continuing to advance and grow in the course of the novels. And then high fantasy, of course, think your Game of Thrones. You get a large cast of characters, magic or magical creatures, and there's often court intrigue, in a huge, richly realized world.
Yeah, so have you read a lot of steampunk books, Elizabeth?
Some.
Some?
I've read, one of my favorite steampunk works isn't actually a book. It's an interactive fiction called 80 Days that reimagines around the world in 80 days. If everything was steam powered, right? And the center of innovation was Africa, not England. So it recasts the story of these two British people traveling the world considerably if they were not the smartest and most techie in the land when they did the traveling, so they get to learn as they go. So I've read some. I looked in on the Parasol Protector. I know that's a common option. And I am familiar with Miyazaki, of course. He's one of the most famous with Nausicaa and Laputa for doing steampunk. How about you? What steampunk are you familiar with?
So steampunk isn't a genre that I usually look for, if that makes sense, when it coincides with other genres. So I read a lot of fantasy, so when it comes in with fantasy, like The Goblin Emperor, so that's how I read this one, is because I was looking for fantasy. And so it's just kind of like, it's one of those genres, like you mentioned, that it overlaps with several. So it's not always just steampunk, like you'll have steampunk and something else sometimes. So that makes it, I think, a pretty cool genre.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you guys should definitely check out steampunk. Definitely check out this book. So I know Elizabeth loves this book. I love this book too. But The Goblin Emperor, so it was written in 2014, which I feel like this book has been in my life longer than that. But it's a fantasy novel. And the author, her name that is not a pseudonym. So her pseudonym is Katherine Addison. So that's the name she wrote under. But her name is Sarah Monet.
That's how I'd say it, yeah.
And this book in particular that she's written has won a lot of awards. So it was nominated for the Nebula, the Hugo, and the World Fantasy Awards, and it got the award for the Locus Award for Best Fantasy Novel. So a lot of people like it, and it's very well received by its critics. But in general, as a summary for the book tells the story of Maya, a young man of mixed elven and goblin heritage who unexpectedly becomes emperor of the elf lands and has to contend with the court's Byzantine power structure as well as racial and social tension in the realm. And so he's the youngest and the least favorite son, and so suddenly he just becomes forced into this situation where he has to become emperor, and so he has to navigate the political intrigue, he has to navigate some of his own personal feelings and background while he's trying to be an emperor. So it's just one of those books that is very character-centric, very good at being very character-centric. So as far as the author goes, so I want to say that The Goblin Emperor is one of her major works. So while looking through some of her other stuff, she's not one of those authors who has a bunch of fantasy novels. Like, she has some other things. She's written some short stories, but I haven't read anything else except The Goblin Emperor. She was born and raised in Tennessee, and she has a PhD in English literature. So she put that to very good use. Very good use.
No kidding.
And she writes, so a lot of her short stories appear in different places. So the Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. So that's one of the books we might actually review, or one of the collections we might review here for another Reader's Corner. And Alchemy, Strange Horizons. So
some really great magazines in there too.
So which ones?
Really great magazines. I like Strange Horizons.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for anyone in the short story book club, I pull a lot of my short stories from Strange Horizons.
Nice. But yeah, and in general, for social media reviews of this book, we have a 4.4 out of 5 for Amazon, kind of a 4 out of 5 for Goodreads. Hoopla has a 4.5. If I rated it, it would be a 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10.
Same. I think that is what I rated it on Goodreads. I was like, it's 5. Just accept it. It's 5 stars.
So everybody loves this book, basically.
You will too. Go get it, please. Not enough people have read this book. This is like the cult classic status. This is the kind of book where you read it and you're like, hello, have you read The Goblin Emperor? And they're like, Game of Thrones? And I'm over there like, no, you need to read this one. This one. I want to talk about this one. But, you know, this is our scheme. We're going to make it a bestseller, Tessie. It's going to be great.
Ooh. Like, I would make this book a bestseller if I could. I would give it free copies to people just so they could read it.
Oh, for sure.
I would buy you a copy of this book. First, I need to buy myself a copy because I realized while I was rereading it for this recording or for this live that I do not own it. And I was like, what? So.
Oh, no. You have to own it. I do not believe I'll keep this book forever. I'm pretty sure what will happen is it will be one of those books where you loan out and then the other person keeps it and never gives it back to you. And you're like, this is a good use of the book because that means that they also love it, and then you buy another copy. So that's the price. If you want one of my books, you have to talk about it with me after you steal it from me. That's the price.
Yep. Fair.
So it's obviously an excellent book and lots of people read it. One of my top 10 faves, and I think you said it was one of yours too. Do you think it fits the genre themes, though, of both steampunk and high fantasy?
Oh, yeah. So it's, the steampunk, I feel like, really stands out in your mind as, like, not only is it a central focus for one of the, several of the major plot points, like there's the airships, but it's like when I imagine this book in my mind, like, I can see the airships, I can see this. Like, my favorite part is where they have, like, the little clockwork model of the bridge that Maya wants to build. And it's like every time I think of this book, I think of that. And I'm like, can I just have my own clockwork model from this book? If they, like, sold those, I would buy it no matter the price. So
absolutely.
And high fantasy. So the politics, which I also love.
Mm-hmm. And there's the goblin. That's in the title. There's the Goblin Emperor. Yes, one of the opening scenes from the book I remember is Maya, so this is from the second chapter, it's not a spoiler. When Maya is riding on the airship to go to eventually get to his coronation and start ruling, he's invited up to the cockpit of the airship to watch the sunrise. And I'm like, ah, yes, this scene is what I think of when I think of the opening of the book. That's nice.
It's a good scene. I didn't remember it during my first read through, but I know what scene you're talking about now.
I forgot about the clockwork and I was happily surprised all over again. I'm like, yes, Clockwork Bridge.
Cool. So for our discussion questions, so we have a few discussion questions we're going to go over for today. And if you guys want to join in, feel free to post in the comments below and let us know what you think about this book if you've read it already. So
please, yes. Or if you have curiosities, because curiosities are great.
We can start a whole Facebook comment, like huge comment section for everybody who loves this book.
Yes, it will be gigantic. We will comment back. It will be so good. You need to do it. What do you think about Maya's character arc, Tessie?
Oh, I think this book, Maya is the main character, and usually I try not to be cliche and be like, I love the main character, but in this book, I'm like, I love the main character. I love him in the way he progresses through this book, which is where he starts being the son of an emperor who doesn't care about him at all. So he's been relegated to this far off little country home where he expects to live out the rest of his days. Like he does have like sort of like as he'll mention later in the book, he has some kind of like fantasy wishes about what he wishes his life would be like. He's like, oh, I wish I could be like one of the emperor's like bodyguards. I don't know how to say that word.
I've been saying it no Hashirai, but I don't even know if that's like correct.
Let's go with that. But it's like he has all these dreams that he knows are dreams that he doesn't think will come true, and he's just like living his life, and then suddenly he's thrust into this situation where he's the emperor and he's not equipped for it at all. And so to see him grow through that and like go from like completely panicked about this situation to slowly finding his footing, I think is an amazing character arc, and I love it.
I love him so much. He's so good. My opinion is not at all nuanced. I'm interested, and I know we're going to talk about it later too, in the fact that he's there's a quote from Tor by Liz Bork that says, Maya, however desperately unhappy and uncertain he may be, is a fundamentally decent person. His response to having been ignored and abused is to be determined to do better. And I'm like, okay, so officially coolest character. Like, good job, Maya, for that.
And it's not every day that you find a character that goes through that and decides that they're going to be nice.
Yes.
To
put it very simply, yes, that decide, oh, you know what? I'm going to actually be a good person. I'm going to be nice.
Yeah. Because a lot of times you find fantasy books where they have like not a great past and they use it as an excuse to, not that we don't love those characters. Morally gray is good, but also it's nice to see someone rise from that and be like, I want to treat people better than I've been treated. So.
Yes, absolutely.
But yeah, so our next question is, what did you like best about this book? And what do you think is the overall appeal of this book?
Okay. I have like a list and it's this long. I looked up Katherine Addison's favorite parts, first of all. So her favorite parts, she liked the traveling coach of the Great Avar, which is super steampunky and techy for those who are interested. She liked the pneumatic tube system too. So she was super into some of the steampunk elements. She liked coming up with the emperor's names. They all have to choose their own individual names in the course of the novel. So Maya has this dilemma where he's like, okay, whatever name I choose is going to say what my ruling style is going to look like. Like, do I pick my dad's name and try to adopt his ruling style? This is a bad plan. I don't want that. Well, then who do I choose? She liked Maya's aunts, they are fantastic. You have a nun, you have a courtier, you have someone with mental health struggles who's treated as just, okay, fine, you're normal. And you have 2 lesbian sea captains, which is also excellent. And her other favorite is Shithero, who is one of my favorites as well. And I have no clue if I said that right. How have you been saying Shithero's name?
A lot of the times while I've been reading this book, I've been skipping over the names. and
That's
just
fair, honestly.
figuring out the character by context. So
It's either Chithero or something. It's Csethiiro for her name. But she is fantastic, and I love her. Slightly too blunt scholar lady who is ready to throw down for the people she cares about at the drop of a hat, which is great. Bravo, my favorite. She's like, what's a good gift? A sword. And I'm like, I respect that. I think my favorite part, though, of the entire book is the dynamic between Maya and his three closest members of his household, for lack of a better word. So Chevette is one of them, and he's the one in charge of managing everything, the secretary, basically. And then there's Kala and Beshalar. And Beshalar is a soldier, Kala is a mage. And they are the Emperor's bodyguards, basically, the Nohashirai. And I love them. They're both great. Beshalar is the most stiff and proper. And Kala's just over there being all sympathetic and slightly too informal and definitely forgot to brush his hair and eat breakfast this morning. And I love them both. I also really like the Sun Cat. The Sun Cat. Did you like the Sun Cat?
I did.
I did.
That
I
was
like. There's the goblins. They're actually nice to Maya, and Maya is perpetually confused throughout the entire novel about like people are nice to me. To me, they are nice. What's the catch? And so there's this little scene at the beginning, and it's the very first time someone's like, no, there's no catch. This is just a gift. This is just for you. And he's like, what? So I loved that. I thought it was good. How about you? What were some of your favorites?
So I want to say that other than Maya's character arc, which I love, which I've expressed during our first question, that I really enjoyed the political intrigue in this book. So when you put political intrigue and fantasy together, I instantly want to read that book. And in this case, it was done very well, to the fact that I feel like the political intrigue that happened made sense. So when there were assassination attempts or there were coups, and the way he dealt with it was so interesting, because it was like, oh, I was almost murdered by, I want to say, what was the aunt? I don't know. He was always almost murdered by his chancellor and an aunt. And his response to that by the end of the book was, I mean, spoiler, but you guys should definitely read the book. It's not that huge of a spoiler. No, it's a very big spoiler.
What to do?
What to do? I'm sorry, I spoiled it.
Spoiler, plug your ears if you don't want to hear it, and then we'll like unplug when you can come back. Okay.
But his response to that was, oh, let me just exile them. So instead of being like consumed by the fact, oh, I was almost murdered, like he kept going along and trying to be emperor, but like there's this brief point where he almost has to be forced to abdicate, was probably going to be murdered, and he goes through that and he deals with it, and then he decides that even though he's angry and he doesn't really forgive them, but he's not going to let it weigh on him. So it was just kind of like a practical approach to these political intrigues that I really enjoyed.
That's true. They did an excellent job with that in this book,
yeah.
I think. And then, the appeal. Right. What is the appeal of this book? I think it's really peaceful for a fantasy. And I know we just talked about an assassination attempt, so like that doesn't necessarily suggest peace. But the Emperor is called Serenity throughout the book. And a huge plot point of the book is Maya trying to find that sense of peace in an environment that is kind of hostile to peace, where he's like, okay, this isn't a peaceful job. The world is not always kind, but I want to be peaceful, me, myself. So I think that's a huge part of the appeal, is that it's just a very fundamentally kind book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with you 100%.
So that said, what do you think are some valid criticisms of this book?
So kind of going off of our last point, so the piece that Maya is trying to accomplish along with the parts that I like with the political intrigue. Um, a lot of people will read that and think it's boring, and so some people think this book is boring, but I don't. I think it's great. Um, some of the chapters are short, so if you like read it in bits and pieces, like I feel like you can appreciate it more. Like this book isn't action packed; it's not supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Another criticism that I have is not so much this book in particular, but just in fantasy in general. That when fantasy books try and deal with issues of race, so obviously Maya at the beginning of the book, one of the reasons why he was never thought to be in line for being emperor is because he's half goblin. So his father ended up having a political marriage with a goblin who is part of a country that's like borders the elf lands.
Right.
It was a political marriage. It did not go well. And so he's half elf, half goblin. And so because of that, and I think, well, definitely because he's one of the fourth son, and definitely because of that, he was never thought to be in line to become emperor. And so it's a major part of the book. But I feel like whenever fantasy addresses the fact of race, they do it at a very shallow level that doesn't actually address the problem of race. So there's a little bit of discrimination in this book, obviously towards Maya when he thinks of himself as ugly, just because he's part goblin and he's been told that all his life. And it's just kind of set up sort of in the Elflands that goblins are lesser.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of does like that shallow painting of what race is about. But in real life, it's a lot more nuanced. There's a lot more to it. And so sometimes when you put that in fantasy, if you don't address those nuances, it isn't the best. But in this book in particular, I still love it, even though it has that element to it. I just wish in
Yeah,
general.
it's worth pointing out at the very least. Like, there's definitely this thing in fantasy where they're like, look, we did goblins. It's like racism. It's exactly the same. And no, it's not though. Sorry, it's not.
That would be my only criticism of this book is if maybe Addison Monet had addressed it a little bit better,
Mm-hmm.
or not better, but more deeply. But then I think that would have changed the focus of the book. But
Yeah, that's fair as well.
so, okay. Um,
What do you think about the world building? Oh, sorry, go on ahead.
No, it's okay. We can move on to world building. I was going to ask you if you have any criticisms.
My criticisms were, I think you summed them up pretty well, honestly, that this could be a little slow for a lot of readers because it's not intended to be fast-paced. And that the goblin elf conflict is a little reductionist if you're going to make it a direct real-world parallel.
Yeah, that's a great word for it, reductionist. World building. The world building in this is very great to the point that I want to read this book with having a list of names in front of me. The beginning of the book helpfully.
You kind of need it.
Yeah, has a list, but it's not. The list is still confusing because some of the author puts such thought into the name system that a character will have several different names, and so if you forget one of the names and you're looking at that list, you're like, I can't find them on the list. So,
right.
Yeah, very in depth, which I feel like by the time I reread this book, like maybe the fifth time, I will appreciate more. At this point, I still need a list. Other than that, I feel like the steampunk elements are great world building. Like they have the airships, and I really appreciate the fact that it seems that she set this book sort of in an industrial setting. So they're at the point where they have this technology that is amazing, but they're still trying to figure out how to use it in a way that is ethically sound. So there's a part where that's just briefly mentioned that there's child labor happening in this nation, and you're like, oh, but it's kind of like that industrial revolution kind of period where they did have child labor, and eventually it would have hopefully be addressed. But so I feel like those elements of the world building were really great.
Yeah, totally agree. It definitely felt like a very rich world. And I was like quietly taking notes on the side. I'm like, how many characters' names begin with the letter C? Because there are so many. But also, because it's a political court, so many of them are referred to exclusively by title that it makes it tough. I liked the religious system too. So that's a big conflict in the book as well, is that this is a kingdom that was not religious, that did not integrate religion. But the reason it didn't is because of this very complicated like history with different religions. There's a really interesting part where they get to investigate a murder because, of course, the previous king, this is not a spoiler, it happens early, died in an airship accident, and they want to find out what happened. So the Lord Chancellor chooses legal investigators, and Maya chooses a witness for the dead, which is a religious person who can talk to the dead, kind of. And so it's interesting that there's that whole, this becomes a huge point of controversy in the book, that Maya is okay with using somebody who's a witness for the dead. And so I thought that was cool, because I've seen religion used in books, but not so integrated into the central conflict as that, and not as this idea of, because it's all mixed up with magic too, right? Talking to the dead.
Yeah.
Little necromantic, perhaps, but it's cool. Anyway.
The magic in the book was interesting too, in that it wasn't blatant. So I thought that was cool.
It was pretty subtle, which I liked, because I liked the tech.
Mm-hmm. So for our next question, so
I want to talk about trauma. Can I talk about trauma? I want to talk about trauma. Okay.
How do you address this question? Yeah.
So there's this whole thing in the book, right, where Maya was not raised to be emperor. He was banished from the court as a small child because emperor didn't like his mom very much. He's a goblin, not too popular, and ends up in this very isolated country house with this guardian cousin named Setherus. And Setherus is the worst, and we hate him always. Setherus sucks. When Maya comes back, so Setherus is verbally and physically abusive, basically. Maya's got physical scars from dealing with Setherus, and even as emperor can't shake the emotional scars that go along with that, right? So he'll be in a conversation with somebody and be over there just not thinking of asking for super basic stuff, like, okay, I would like clothes that fit and look nice. I would like food that I like. He doesn't even know what food he likes. He has a little bit of difficulty trusting people or being vulnerable. And then the most poignant part for me is that occasionally he'll be in an interaction and he can hear what Setherus would say. And sometimes he slips up and he says it and then beats himself up afterwards. And that was rough, but it's interesting because you often get like the all the way good protagonists who like, they were virtuous and they were Cinderella and they deserved better than this terrible abuse. And then they leave and they're angels once again, like, have courage, be kind. And so, okay, but that's not how it works. Maya still carries this understanding that the only leadership he's ever known has been Setherus, who is the worst. And so he has who he wants to be, which is, you know, a good person and like kind to everybody. And that is his individual instinct, but in pressured situations, he can catch himself reverting to Setherus. And I just found that super interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that is one of the main draws of this book. Is that in particular, is just the way it's more realistic than you would usually find in a fantasy novel. And because of that, I feel like a lot of people can relate to that more, and I feel like that's why this book is so well loved.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. It's so good. Go read it. What are you still curious about after reading the book? I know there's a sequel, which I'm excited for. But
no, I am very curious about the sequel. I think the first time I read this book, I was like, where's my sequel? Where is my sequel? And now I know that we're going to be getting one eventually, even though it doesn't follow Maya's story. It'll follow Selhar, but also I think he's a cool character and I would like to know more about him. So I'm curious for the sequel. I think I am still curious to see how Maya progresses with his policies. I mentioned a little bit earlier, like there's a small little part where you kind of find out like, oh, there's some child labor. Um, there's a cult / religion that kind of pops up that's integral to the main plot, where some of the people in there have grievances against the airship companies. And so I would like to see how he deals with these problems and how he, like, I feel like the setting of the book is at a point where he can do so much good for his nation, for his country. Just seeing how he has been doing with his policies so far. And I would like to see that good keep happening, just so I can get some
Into the
like,
future.
yeah, some happy fluffy vibes about everything working out. I think that would be great.
That would be so good. I would love that. I'm really curious, like you, about the events at the end of the book, and seeing how Maya's rule as Edrahasavar develops, because there's so many cool things that he's attempting. I would also love a companion novel, I think, from the Nohashirais, the bodyguard's point of view, because when Maya shows up at the court, everyone's like, aha, we've heard terrible things about you. And so then you have these guards who are like, okay, you are assigned to the emperor. If he dies, you die. Have fun. And so they show up and they have no idea what to think of this kid who just came from the backwater. And by the end of the book, they are like, hello, I have had Maya for a day and a half, but if anything happens to him, I will kill everyone in this room and then myself, which is just great that I was doing the meme. But yes, it is excellent and I love it. And would like to see that progression from their point of view. It's also kind of cool because I don't see a lot of other books that do this kind of thing as far as it goes. I think this reminded me of a couple of other books, like Court Duel by Sherwood Smith has some of the court intrigue going on, Kindness and the Country Fish Out of Water. And then Bitter Blue by Kristen Kishore has an entire nation processing the impact of trauma and a young ruler struggling to uncover the truth of what's going on. So that's a good read. Did this book remind you of any other books at all?
Yes, and also your book list, I will start reading those 2 books right away. Just because after I finish this book, I'm like, oh, I need more books like this, so I'll read those 2 books. When I was reading this book in particular, I came to mind, there's one book, The Curse of Chalion by Bujold, and that's an entire series. I haven't gotten all the way through the series, but one thing I would say that makes it like the Goblin Emperor is having this main character kind of put in a situation where they suddenly have a lot more responsibilities. In The Curse of Chalion, it's kind of like magic / magic is religion book, where he becomes host for demon, half demon, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And him dealing with that. And in the way like the Goblin Emperor, it's sort of that they both approach it in really practical manners. So it's like you can see a little bit of yourself as a person in these characters. So not as heroes, but as people. So sometimes when you're reading high fantasy and there's this hero that you're reading about and you're like, I could never be like this person because they are too amazing. I feel like in the Goblin Emperor and then the Curse of Chalion, you can kind of look at it and be like, well, I can see a little bit of myself in that character. If you like political intrigue and you want to dial that up by like 100, 1,000, maybe 1,000,000, you can read the Traitor Beru Komrat.
Oh yeah.
So that one,
I
highly recommend. I read the second book. I'm a little bit more iffy about that one, but that one, I'm going to wait until the 3rd book comes out for that one, and then I'm going to form my opinion about the series so far.
I've been waiting for the 3rd one to read the 2nd one, because like I cannot take another cliffhanger. I can't do it.
No, wait until the 3rd one comes out before you read the 2nd one, because the 2nd one is basically a filler. So
good to know. But the first one could work as a standalone, honestly. Like I just sat there and I was like, finished it, and I'm like, okay, tears, all the tears. So yes, I totally agree with you for Baru Kormrat, and I am writing down The Curse of Chalion in my book or on my hand or wherever I need to write it down to go order that, because heck yeah, I need more Goblin Emperor type books in my life. Mm-hmm. Excellent. So if any viewers have questions or comments or concerns, please say some. I know we're almost out of time. People should turn in for our next virtual story time. And then there's a mystery read, right? Coming up on Thursday. Thursday.
I can't say what the book is because that's the entire point of the mystery read.
It's true. That is the point of the mystery read.
Do not know.
Tune in. Find out. And then next week's genre will be Fantastic Land by Mike Bakoven.
It's going to be horror. So I'm glad I'm not doing that one because I don't like horror. So.
Yeah, horror scares me, but you should tune in. So Fantastic Land, and the day before that we get a mystery read. So good things coming next week. I hope you enjoy Monday's virtual story time and see you all soon. Thanks for tuning in.